While I was there and part of managing this food program, I was invited to go on a trip with the World Food Program into South Sudan to deliver food to a community. This community hadn't received food for a couple of weeks, and they were entirely dependent on the food that we were about to drop off. And so it was that I went to Kenya's busiest airport, an airport that no one's ever heard of, called Lokichokio. It's the busiest airport because it is from that point that an operation called Operation Lifeline Sudan has run for decades now, providing support to South Sudanese people to allow them, for the most part, simply to survive. The planes there are these enormous Hercules planes that are kind of like warehouses with wings, absolutely ginormous, and every hour or so they get loaded up with 2 tracks of 8 tons of food donated by the international community. Those 2 tracks of food get loaded up in these enormous pallets, and the plane takes off with a crew of 5 people. The 5 people are the pilot and the co-pilot, and an engineer who sits immediately behind them. Those 3 people on my flight, importantly, were Filipino. And then there were 2 other gentlemen who were Kenyan, who sat just behind them, and for the vast majority of the flight, did absolutely nothing. We flew for a couple of hours across South Sudan, and South Sudan, although it was at that time and still is now a war zone, is, not that you ever hear about it, spectacularly beautiful. It has the Nile River winding through it. It is so flat that it makes the Netherlands look like the Himalayas, and it is pristine and green and virtually untouched, but for the very occasional little village populated by a few people and a lot of cows, dotted all across the landscape. So we flew for a couple of hours across the country, and eventually we came to this tiny little town, waiting for the food supply that we had in the back of the plane, donated by the international community. And as we came in, the 2 Kenyan guys got up and said, "Oh, would you like to come to the back of the plane?" I said, sure. I didn't know what that meant, but no problem. They handed me a whole series of ropes, and I kind of put ropes all over me. I had looked like a kind of monkey harness thing that went all over me. Went out the back, and it was completely pitch dark, quite cold, and I had no idea where I was or what I was about to do. I also had no idea what the purpose of the harness was, but one of them kind of grabbed a part of the harness, particularly a bit that kind of came from my belly button, yanked it, and I kind of heard a clipping noise as I was clipped into the back of the plane. The reason I was clipped into the back of the plane was because of what was about to happen. They said, kind of step over there, I stepped over there. They said, take a few more steps, I took a few more steps. They said, a couple more, I took a couple more. And eventually I found that my feet were no longer level, but I actually had one foot slightly higher than the other. The reason for that became clear a few moments later. We flew down very low, and as we flew down, the engineer at the front of the plane with a single button, pressed the button to mark, as I later learnt, the GPS coordinates of the so-called drop zone, an area 100 metres by 100 metres where the international community would physically deliver to this community the food that they needed to survive. As we stood at the back of the plane, as I say, pitch dark, totally quiet, no idea what was about to happen, until there was a new rumbling sound that entered the area. And the new rumble was as a top flap opened up, and all of a sudden light streamed into the back of the plane, and the rumble got a whole lot louder because I was exposed to the elements. I was quite overwhelmed at this point until the next step happened, which was the second flap opened. Now, it turns out that's why one leg was higher than the other, because I was on that flap. The flap opened out, and all of a sudden I was totally exposed to the elements. My trousers going whack, 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 whack against my leg as the wind kind of rushes through. And below me is the community that are waiting for our food, South Sudan lying before me with all of my personal connections to it. It was totally, totally overwhelming to be there doing this thing. These two Kenyan guys that I mentioned at the start are standing there in front of the first track of 8 tons of food. There's one of them with a headset. The headset's linked to the guy in the cockpit who'd marked the GPS. The other one is standing there with this enormous machete, absolutely enormous. They're standing right next to each other, not far from me. I'm plastered against the sidewall. Turns out the reason I had this stupid monkey harness thing was so that I didn't then fall out with the food that was about to be dumped. We come into the drop zone. As we come into the drop zone, the plane kind of jerks upwards at a very slight angle in order to allow for the food to go out. The food won't go out until the food is released, hence the machete. The guy with the earphones on, he's got his earphones on, he's listening to the countdown. The countdown happens from the cockpit. The man in the cockpit counts us down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, whack with the machete, and all of a sudden 8 tons of food goes flying past like a train that didn't exist before, straight out, enormous noise, out the back, complete silence, and then they kind of fall out like this and fall on the ground. Sounded a little bit like distant fireworks. Unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable as an experience. There I was, seeing in the most visceral, direct sense what globalization looks like, what the world, interconnected as we now are, actually translates to in a very, very real context. At the end of the first drop of 8 tons, I kind of did a check to see that I had 4 limbs and so on still, and realised that actually I'd spent the previous 3 or 4 minutes totally involuntarily screaming like a baby and sweating like a pig. I mean, I was a complete mess, total write-off. The plane kind of closed up. We then moved to the other side. We then did the second lot of 8 tons. At the end of it, partially because of my personal connection to the South Sudanese story, I looked at these 2 Kenyan guys, and in particular the one with the machete, and it occurred to me that what he was doing was almost the most purely good job that I could imagine. What an unbelievable thing to do, to deliver for all of us food to the people in the world who needed it most. I was, in the moment at least, in love with this man, or at least his job. We went back to the cockpit, and I eventually gathered myself together. The reason I tell the whole of that story, much as I say it was a highlight of my life, is actually because of what happened next. What happened next was we settled into the cockpit for our 2 or 3 hour flight home, and there was this man I was looking at lovingly at this point, settling in for the long trip back where he didn't have much to do. And he leaned over in the cockpit and picked up what was the only book in the whole plane and started reading. And I happened to notice, because I was sitting opposite him, the title of the book. And I was so shocked by it that I wrote it down. The title of the book was, and I quote, "The Purpose-Driven Life, what on earth am I here for?" Now, the reason I tell the story on this occasion is because it occurred to me that he symbolised precisely that all-important lesson of the importance of reflection, the importance of analysis of what it is you're doing and why you are doing it, that to my mind this institute is established to set up. Straight after that flight I went back to Kakuma, and straight after that, in a curious coincidence of horrendous events, we ran out of food. We ran out of food for 90,000 people just for a few days. But it was my job, wearing the UN blue that we're all familiar with, to stand in front of literally thousands of people and explain to them that we had no food, notwithstanding being told to come to a place to collect it, and that they needed to go home and come back another day. It's the hardest message I've ever had to deliver. When I went back that night and did my own reflection, the incredibly simple maybe even trite thought occurred to me, which is, again, the most direct link in my mind with the work the Institute will do, that actually I, as a citizen of this country, had far more capacity as a citizen to impact the situation for those people there on the other side of the world than I had by being there. The power came from the fact that I, as a citizen of this wealthy country, was able to influence the government that could send precisely the food that was needed, the kind of food that we just delivered elsewhere, that this community was entirely dependent on. The profundity of the interconnectedness of our world, of globalisation and citizenship being eternally linked, was never more so directly apparent to me. I think that we live in a time where our citizenry is more global and each of us is more a citizen of the globe than has ever been true before. And is for that reason that I think this institute is both timely and important, and I suspect I speak on behalf of everyone in saying we wish it a long and happy life.